A furious preacher hurls red paint across the Virgin Mary's marble face, convinced he's exposing religious fraud. Crimson streams pour down like blood from a wound. But then, the impossible begins. The ground trembles. Wind roars from nowhere, while trees stand motionless. Lightning splits a cloudless sky. Church bells ring without human hands. And crystal-clear water bubbles from beneath the statue's feet, washing away every trace of paint as if invisible hands were cleansing the stone. What started as hatred became the catalyst for miracles that transformed an entire community. The mute boy found his voice. The crippled woman stood tall. The broken veteran's pain vanished. But the greatest miracle? Watching a heart filled with rage learn to love. And a town discover that forgiveness can wash away the deepest stains. Please like and comment below. Don't forget to subscribe for more testimonies of God's miraculous work in our modern world. Let us know where you're watching from. We love hearing from our brothers and sisters in faith around the globe. The morning sky over Clearwater, Ohio, hung heavy with October mist. This was farm country, where life moved to the ancient rhythm of planting and harvest, where neighbors knew each other's families going back 3 generations, and where the tallest structure for miles was the white steeple of St. Mary's Catholic Church. In the town square, positioned on a simple concrete pedestal before the church's modest brick facade, stood a statue that had watched over Clearwater for 45 years. Carved from white Carrara marble, the Virgin Mary stood with arms outstretched in eternal welcome, her face lifted toward heaven with an expression of such profound serenity that even lifelong skeptics found themselves pausing when they passed. The statue hadn't always been there. It arrived in 1978, brought by the Nguyen family, Vietnamese refugees who'd fled the war with nothing but the clothes on their backs and an unshakable faith in divine providence. Phan Nguyen had worked double shifts at the grain elevator while his wife Mai cleaned houses and took in sewing. For 3 years, they saved every spare penny for a promise they'd made during the terrifying boat journey across the South China Sea. When pirates attacked their overcrowded vessel and it seemed certain they would all perish, Phan had knelt on the blood-stained deck and made a vow to the Blessed Mother. "If you save my family, if you bring us to safety, we will honor you with a monument of thanksgiving in whatever land becomes our home." The marble had been expensive, far more than a family of factory workers should have been able to afford. But the community had rallied around the project. Protestant families contributed alongside Catholics. The Methodist Ladies Auxiliary held bake sales. The Baptist men's group donated lumber for scaffolding. Even non-believers found themselves dropping coins into collection jars that appeared in every shop on Main Street. "It's not about religion," said Bill Hartman, a Lutheran farmer who'd served in Vietnam and understood what the Nguyens had left behind. "It's about gratitude, about keeping promises. That's something any decent person can respect." Over the decades, the statue had become more than a Catholic symbol. Farmers driving their combines to early morning harvests would tip their caps as they passed. Children on bicycles would slow down, crossing themselves with casual reverence before racing toward the swimming hole behind Miller's barn. High school sweethearts posed for prom pictures at Mary's feet. Veterans returning from various wars left their medals tucked beneath fresh flowers, wordless offerings from men who'd seen too much death to take life for granted. "There's something about her eyes," Martha Jenkins often said. Martha sold the best apple pies in 3 counties at the farmer's market and had been a Methodist since birth. "It's like she's not just looking at you. She's seeing you, really seeing you, all the way down to your bones." The statue had weathered 4.5 decades of Ohio seasons. Ice storms that brought down power lines left Mary untouched. The tornado of '94 that destroyed half of Main Street somehow missed the church square entirely. Vandals had occasionally targeted other parts of town, but no one had ever dared touch the Virgin. But not everyone felt the same way about Clearwater's marble guardian. Dr. Robert Miller, the retired chemistry professor who'd moved to Clearwater from Chicago 5 years earlier, represented the town's small but vocal skeptical minority. A lifelong academic with 40 years of university teaching behind him, Miller had chosen the rural community for its low cost of living and quiet streets, not for its spiritual atmosphere. "It's just carved stone," he would mutter when neighbours spoke too enthusiastically about the statue's supposed influence. People project whatever they want onto it. Psychological projection, confirmation bias, the usual tricks the mind plays on itself. His neighbours respected Dr. Miller's scientific knowledge, but they shook their heads at his cynicism, particularly when it came to matters of faith. This delicate balance between faith and doubt had maintained itself peacefully for decades. The believers believed, the skeptics remained skeptical, and everyone got along well enough to make Clearwater one of those rare small towns where neighbours still helped each other and children played safely in the streets. All of that was about to change. The disruption came in the form of Reverend Paul Harris, a travelling preacher with piercing blue eyes and magnetic presence that could fill a room just by walking into it. Harris had no permanent church, no established denomination, no seminary credentials that anyone could verify. What he had was absolute certainty, a worn leather Bible, and conviction that God had called him to restore what he called true Christianity to a nation that had fallen away from its spiritual foundations. He'd arrived in Clearwater 6 months before that misty October morning, renting a small trailer on the outskirts of town and setting up revival meetings in the community center every Wednesday evening and Sunday afternoon. His early sermons had focused on familiar themes: personal salvation, moral relativism, the importance of reading Scripture literally. At first, people had given him the benefit of the doubt. Small towns were used to itinerant preachers and religious enthusiasts of various stripes. Harris was articulate, well-versed in biblical quotations, and passionate about his beliefs. But as weeks turned to months, Harris's tone had grown darker, his message more combative. He began describing Clearwater as a community infected with false worship, warning that the town's apparent peace and prosperity were actually signs of spiritual complacency. And increasingly, his attention focused on the statue. "Do you not see the deception right in front of your eyes?" he thundered during one particularly intense evening service. "That carved stone sits in your town square like a golden calf, drawing hearts away from the living God. People kneel to it, cry to it, leave offerings at its feet as if marble can save them." The small congregation shifted uncomfortably. Even those drawn to Harris's uncompromising message found his words about the statue troubling. The Virgin had been part of Clearwater's landscape for longer than many of them had been alive. Attacking her felt like attacking the town itself. Harris's passion wasn't burning itself out. If anything, it was intensifying, fed by what he saw as the community's stubborn refusal to acknowledge what he considered obvious spiritual truth. He began standing across from the church square at sunset, staring at the statue with an intensity that made passers-by uncomfortable. Children started crossing the street to avoid him. He spent his days in the trailer, writing in a leather-bound journal with increasingly erratic handwriting. The entries started as theological reflections, but gradually became obsessive planning. "The idol mocks God's face," he wrote on one page. "Every smile directed at the stone image is a rejection of divine truth." On another page, "If I destroy the false image, perhaps the spell will break. Perhaps then they will listen to the word of the Lord instead of trusting in carved vanities." And finally, in handwriting that shook with excitement or madness, "The time has come. God requires action, not just words. Tomorrow I will show them that their idol bleeds like any earthly thing." As dawn approached on that misty October morning, Paul Harris loaded a 5-gallon bucket of red barn paint into the back of his pickup truck. His hands were steady, his mind clear, his conscience untroubled. He believed absolutely that he was about to do God's will. He was about to discover just how wrong a certain man could be. The sun had barely cleared the horizon when Paul Harris parked his battered pickup truck just beyond the edge of St. Mary's Square. The town was still asleep. Farmers wouldn't begin their morning chores for another hour, and Main Street remained empty except for a stray cat picking through garbage cans behind Henderson's Diner. Harris sat in his truck for several minutes, staring at the statue through the windshield. In the early morning light, the Virgin's marble face seemed to glow with inner radiance. Her arms remained outstretched in eternal welcome. Her eyes lifted toward heaven with that expression of profound peace that had comforted countless souls over the decades. For just a moment, something flickered in Harris's chest. Not doubt exactly, but strange hesitation. The statue looked so serene, so innocent. Could something that brought such obvious comfort to so many people really be an abomination in God's sight? But the moment passed quickly, crushed beneath the weight of his obsession. "Beautiful deceptions are the most dangerous," he muttered, repeating a phrase he'd written in his journal. He climbed out of the truck and wrestled the paint bucket from the bed. The red paint was thick and viscous, the kind used to mark boundary lines on barns, designed to be visible from great distances and to resist weathering. Harris had chosen it deliberately for its symbolic value. Red like blood, red like sin, red like the judgment that would expose the statue's powerlessness. The square was utterly silent as he approached the pedestal. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. Standing face to face with the marble Virgin, he could see details that were invisible from ground level. The subtle variations in stone texture that gave depth to her features. The way the sculptor had carved her robe's folds to suggest gentle movement. The incredible skill required to create such lifelike beauty from raw stone. Again, that strange hesitation flickered through his consciousness. This was clearly the work of a master craftsman, created with love and reverence. Could destroying art really be God's will? But Harris pushed the doubt away with the force of a man who'd staked his entire identity on being right. He pried the lid off the paint bucket and gripped the metal rim with both hands. "Let's see if you bleed like the rest of us," he snarled. And with one violent motion, he hurled the contents over Mary's head. Crimson paint gushed across the statue's face and cascaded down her white robes in rivers of red. From a distance, it looked exactly like what Harris had intended, as if the marble Virgin was bleeding from terrible wounds. The paint pooled at the base of the pedestal and began spreading across the concrete in scarlet streams. Harris stepped back, paint bucket dangling from one hand, a satisfied smirk spreading across his face. "There," he said aloud, his voice echoing in the empty square. "Now let's see how many pilgrims come to pray to a bloodied idol." He never finished his thought. The ground beneath his feet began to tremble, not with violent earthquake shaking, but with something deeper and more fundamental, as if the earth itself was responding to what had just occurred. Harris stumbled, his smirk faltering as he struggled to maintain balance on the vibrating concrete. Then came the wind. It roared through the square from nowhere, a tremendous gust that sent Harris's hair whipping around his face and nearly knocked him off the pedestal. But strangely, all the trees surrounding the square remained perfectly still, their leaves unruffled by any breeze. The wind seemed to exist only in the immediate vicinity of the statue, as if the very air was reacting to the desecration. Harris looked around wildly, his confidence beginning to crack. This wasn't supposed to happen. He'd expected shock, outrage, perhaps some angry confrontations with townspeople. He hadn't expected the elements themselves to respond. The lightning came next. A brilliant bolt split the dawn sky with impossible precision, striking the massive oak tree that stood at the eastern edge of the church property. The crack of impact was deafening, and bark exploded outward like shrapnel. Harris threw himself flat against the pedestal as chunks of wood rained down around him. But the lightning seemed to have come from a cloudless sky. Harris looked up, squinting against the morning sun, and saw not a single cloud anywhere in the heavens. Lightning from clear skies was meteorologically impossible. Yet it had just happened right before his eyes. Thunder followed, rolling across the town like the voice of judgment itself. Windows rattled in their frames. Car alarms began wailing. Dogs throughout Clearwater began howling in harmony, as if every animal in town was responding to some frequency only they could hear. And then, impossibly, inexplicably, the church bells began to ring. The deep bronze voices of Saint Mary's bells echoed across the square, but not in their usual measured pattern for calling the faithful to worship. These were wild, desperate peals, as if the bells themselves were crying out in anguish. They rang with mournful urgency that spoke of tragedy, of something precious being violated. Harris pressed his hands to his ears, but the sound seemed to come from inside his skull, as well as from the bell tower. He knew everyone in town would later confirm that no human hand was pulling those bell ropes. Yet the bells rang on, their bronze voices weeping over the defiled statue. By the time the first townspeople began emerging from their homes, drawn by the lightning and the impossible bells, something even stranger was happening. The paint was moving. What had moments ago covered Mary's face and robes in thick, viscous streams was now thinning, flowing, behaving like liquid despite being heavy barn paint designed to adhere permanently to any surface. The red was trickling downward more rapidly than physics should have allowed, as if invisible hands were washing the stains away. And from beneath Mary's feet, from solid concrete that had been bone dry for 45 years, a stream of crystal clear water began to bubble forth. Harris watched in growing terror as the impossible spring flowed steadily across the base of the pedestal, spreading in all directions. Where the clear water touched the red paint, the stains simply vanished. Not diluted, not thinned, but completely eliminated as if they had never existed. The water was unlike anything Harris had ever seen. It caught the morning light like liquid crystal, so pure it seemed to glow with its own inner radiance. As it flowed, it created a soft, musical sound, not the harsh babble of ordinary water, but something that sounded almost like whispered prayers or distant choir voices. People were running toward the square now, some still in their bathrobes and slippers, all drawn by the bells and the lightning, and the sense that something unprecedented was occurring in their quiet town. Harris tried to climb down from the pedestal, but his legs wouldn't support him. He slumped against the base of the statue, staring up at Mary's face. The paint was almost gone now, washed away by the impossible water. But as the red stains disappeared, Harris realized something that made his breath catch in his throat. The statue looked different. Not just clean, but somehow more radiant than before. The marble seemed to glow with warmth despite the October chill. And Mary's eyes, carved stone eyes that had gazed serenely over clear water for decades, seemed to be looking directly at him. Not with anger or condemnation, but with a sadness so profound it pierced him like a physical wound. In that marble gaze, Harris saw not the wrath he'd expected, but infinite compassion mixed with infinite sorrow. It was the look a mother might give a child who'd done something terrible, not from malice, but from confusion and pain. This can't be," Harris whispered, his voice barely audible over the continuing sound of the bells. But even as he spoke, he knew that what he was witnessing was real. The water flowing from solid concrete was real. The bells ringing without ringers were real. The way his act of vandalism had somehow triggered forces beyond his understanding was undeniably, impossibly real. The first townspeople reached the square just as the last traces of paint dissolved in the flowing stream. They stopped as if they'd hit an invisible wall, staring at the scene before them with expressions of shock and wonder. Eleanor Price had lived with arthritis for 23 years. The 80-year-old widow could barely walk from her bedroom to the kitchen without her cane and a parade of pain medications that never quite worked. But that morning, drawn by the impossible sound of church bells ringing without ringers, she'd shuffled to the square faster than she'd moved in decades. What she saw stopped her heart. The statue gleamed like new snow in sunlight. At Mary's feet, water bubbled from the earth itself, pure, clear, and mysteriously warm despite the October chill. Eleanor approached on trembling legs. Without thinking, she knelt by the stream and cupped the water in her gnarled hands. As the liquid touched her lips, warmth spread through her body like sunrise breaking over frozen fields. Slowly, impossibly, she straightened. The cane slipped from her fingers. For the first time in over 2 decades, Eleanor Price stood tall. "Dear God in heaven," she whispered, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "The pain. It's gone." Nearby, 6-year-old Tommy Rogers tugged on his mother's sleeve. Tommy had been born mute, his silence a source of constant heartbreak for the family. His mother, Linda, held him close as they watched Eleanor's transformation with wonder and disbelief. Tommy broke free from his mother's grip and ran to the stream. Before Linda could stop him, he cupped water to his lips. His throat convulsed. His eyes went wide. "Mama," he whispered. The single word hit Linda like a physical blow. Her son, her silent, beautiful boy, had spoken for the first time in his life. "Mama!" Tommy cried again, his voice growing stronger, clearer. "Mama, I can talk!" Linda collapsed beside the stream, pulling Tommy into her arms as both dissolved into tears of joy. Around them, more townspeople arrived, drawn by Eleanor's cries and Tommy's impossible voice. By noon, the square overflowed with people. Veterans tested arthritic joints in the healing water. Farmers brought sick animals that lapped from the stream and rose renewed. Children splashed in the shallow flow, their laughter mixing with adult tears of amazement. Daniel Martinez had driven 3 hours from Cincinnati after hearing radio reports. A 32-year-old veteran of the Afghanistan War, Daniel had lost his left leg below the knee to an improvised explosive device. The physical amputation had been traumatic enough, but the phantom pain that followed had nearly driven him to suicide. His wife Rosa had begged him to come to Clearwater after hearing Tommy Rogers' story on the morning news. Daniel had been skeptical, but Rosa's tearful pleas had finally convinced him to make the drive. He knelt awkwardly beside the stream, his prosthetic making it difficult to find a comfortable position. Daniel splashed the water over his prosthetic leg and the scarred stump above it, feeling slightly ridiculous but trying to honor Rosa's faith. At first, nothing happened. He started to rise, ready to tell his wife they should head home. Then the phantom pain, his constant companion for 2 years, simply ceased to exist. Daniel stood perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. The burning sensation that never left him. The stabbing agony that visited him dozens of times each day. The crushing pressure that made sleep almost impossible. All of it was gone. "Rosa," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Rosa, it doesn't hurt. For the first time in 2 years, it doesn't hurt at all." His wife threw herself into his arms, both weeping and laughing simultaneously. Dr. Robert Miller arrived at the square with his black case of scientific instruments, determined to find rational explanations for what everyone was calling miracles. But as he knelt beside the stream to collect water samples, his certainty began to crack. The liquid was purer than anything he'd tested in 40 years of laboratory work. Its pH was perfectly balanced. It contained no minerals, no bacteria, no impurities of any kind. Under his portable microscope, it appeared to be composed of nothing but hydrogen and oxygen in their most basic form. Yet it flowed from solid concrete that had been dry for decades. "This is impossible," he muttered, running test after test and getting the same inexplicable results. Anne Miller knelt beside her husband, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Maybe impossible is just another word for miraculous," she suggested. Miller looked up at his wife, then at the statue, then at the growing crowd of people whose lives were being transformed by encounters with the mysterious water. For the first time in his adult life, his scientific skepticism wavered. That night, as Clearwater settled into uneasy sleep, something extraordinary began happening in bedrooms throughout the town. People who had never shared a dream, never even spoken beyond polite nods on Main Street, found themselves experiencing identical visions. Dr. Robert Miller was the first to wake, gasping and disoriented in his bedroom on Maple Street. In his dream, he'd been standing in his old laboratory at the University of Chicago, surrounded by beakers and test tubes and all the familiar instruments of scientific inquiry. But instead of chemicals, every container held the same crystal clear water that now flowed from the statue. A woman had been standing across from him, not young, not old, but somehow timeless. Her robes were the deepest blue Miller had ever seen, and her dark hair was partially covered by a veil that seemed to contain actual stars. "Robert," she had said, and her voice reached directly into his heart rather than his ears. "Why do you fear what your intellect cannot contain? Science is my son's gift to you, but wisdom knows when to kneel before mystery." "I don't understand," Miller had replied in the dream. "Water doesn't flow from stone. Bodies don't heal instantaneously. These things violate every law I've ever taught." The woman had smiled with infinite gentleness. "And yet they happen. Perhaps your laws are not chains to bind reality, but tools to better appreciate when reality transcends them." 6 blocks away, Martha Jenkins sat up in her narrow bed, her own identical dream still vivid in memory. She'd been in her kitchen, kneading bread as she had thousands of times before, but the dough beneath her hands had been glowing with soft, warm light. The same woman in blue had been standing beside her oven, watching with approving eyes. "Martha," the voice had said, "you have fed bodies all your life with your bread. Now help me feed souls with hope. Tell them what you have witnessed." Throughout Clearwater, similar dreams unfolded in sleeping minds of believers and skeptics alike. Eleanor Price dreamed of walking without pain through fields of flowers that never wilted. Tommy Rogers dreamed of singing hymns with a choir of angels, his voice pure and strong. Even Paul Harris, collapsed in exhaustion in his trailer, dreamed of the woman in blue placing gentle hands on his tormented conscience. But the most significant dream belonged to young Sarah Kim, a pediatric nurse who had driven down from Columbus with her 7-year-old daughter Lucy. Sarah had brought Lucy to Clearwater as a last resort. Her daughter had been fighting acute lymphoblastic leukemia for 18 months. Chemotherapy, radiation, bone marrow tests that left the little girl weak and nauseated. In Sarah's dream, she was back in the pediatric oncology ward where she'd spent so many anxious hours over the past year and a half. But instead of sterile hospital lighting and constant beeping of machines, the room was filled with warm, golden radiance. Lucy was there, but not the pale, weakened child Sarah had carried to bed. This was Lucy, as she used to be. Vibrant, laughing, her hair thick and shining, her eyes bright with mischief and joy. "Mama," Dream Lucy said, "the nice lady says, I'm going to be okay. She says the sickness is going away." Sarah turned to see the woman in blue robes standing beside Lucy's hospital bed, her hands resting gently on the child's shoulders. The stranger's face was filled with such profound love that Sarah felt her knees weaken. "Your daughter will live," the woman said, her voice carrying absolute certainty. Not because she deserves healing more than other children, but because her story will help others believe that love is stronger than death. At dawn, Sarah woke to find Lucy sitting up in bed, more alert and energetic than she'd been in months. The child's color had improved dramatically overnight, and for the first time since beginning chemotherapy, she was asking for breakfast. They returned to the statue that morning, joining the growing crowd of pilgrims and curious onlookers. As Lucy knelt beside the stream and cupped more water to her lips, something visible happened. The child's wan complexion became pink with healthy circulation. Her eyes brightened from dull brown to sparkling amber. Even her thin hair seemed to thicken and take on new luster. Word of Lucy's dramatic improvement spread quickly through the gathering crowd, but her miracle was just one of many that day. Paul Harris had spent the night in spiritual crisis, his entire worldview shattered by events he'd witnessed. In his dream, he stood once again in the town square, but it was transformed into something that looked more like paradise than small-town Ohio. The statue was still there, but it seemed alive, radiant with inner light. And beside it stood the woman herself, no longer marble, but flesh and blood. "Paul," she said, and her voice held no condemnation, only infinite sadness. "Why did you think destruction could serve creation? Why did you believe hatred could honor love?" Harris fell to his knees in the dream, overwhelmed by shame and regret. "I thought I was defending God's truth. I thought the statue was leading people away from him." "And where do you think my son learned compassion?" she asked gently. "I am not his competitor, child. I am his first teacher." Harris woke from the dream with tears streaming down his face. But for the first time in years, they weren't tears of rage or frustration. They were tears of relief, of a burden finally lifted, of a heart beginning to heal. 3 days after the paint incident, Paul Harris couldn't leave. Even as his rational mind screamed at him to flee Clearwater, something held him rooted to the spot where his act of vandalism had unleashed forces beyond his comprehension. On the third night, a fierce storm rolled across the Ohio plains. Lightning split the sky while thunder shook windows throughout the town. Rain lashed the square, but the candles at Mary's feet refused to be extinguished, their flames dancing defiantly in the wind. Harris knelt in the downpour, his clothes soaked, his spirit broken. "What have I done?" he whispered to the storm. "What have I done?" That's when he heard her voice. It didn't come through his ears. The words formed directly in his heart, carried on the wind and rain, woven into the very fabric of the storm itself. A woman's voice, infinitely gentle, yet filled with unshakable strength. "Paul," she said, and hearing his name from those invisible lips nearly stopped his heart. "Why do you rage against love? Why do you fear what you cannot understand?" Harris looked up at the statue through the rain. For just a moment, though he would never be certain if it was reality or vision, Mary's marble eyes seemed to meet his. In that gaze, he saw not condemnation, but infinite compassion. I thought I was serving God," he choked through his tears. "You were serving fear," the voice replied, neither harsh nor gentle, simply truthful. "But fear can become love, child. Pride can become humility. Even the greatest sins can become the seeds of the greatest grace." "I don't deserve forgiveness," Harris sobbed. "None of my children deserve it," came the reply, warm as sunlight after winter. "That's why it's called grace." The storm passed as suddenly as it had come. In the sudden silence, Harris found himself surrounded by townspeople who'd been drawn from their homes by supernatural voices many had also heard echoing through the night. Father Michael O'Connor, the elderly priest of St. Mary's, knelt beside the broken preacher. "Brother," he said softly, "what did you hear?" Harris looked up at the priest with eyes red from weeping. "Forgiveness," he whispered. "I heard forgiveness." Word of Clearwater's healing spring spread across Ohio and beyond. By the end of October, pilgrims arrived from neighboring states, carrying their sick, their wounded, their spiritually empty. The miracles multiplied like loaves and fishes. Maria Santos had driven 18 hours from San Antonio, Texas, carrying her 4-year-old grandson Miguel, who'd been born with cerebral palsy. The little boy's muscles were severely affected, his speech limited to a few barely comprehensible words, his mobility restricted to a specialized wheelchair. But as she carried Miguel to the statue on their second day in town, something unprecedented occurred. The child, who normally remained passive and unresponsive to most stimuli, suddenly began trying to speak. "Agua," he said, the Spanish word for water emerging with startling clarity. "Quiero agua." Maria nearly dropped him in shock. Miguel had never spoken a complete sentence before. She knelt beside the flowing water and helped Miguel cup it in his small hands. As he drank, something remarkable happened. The rigid muscle tension that had characterized his condition since birth began to relax. His twisted limbs straightened. His unfocused eyes suddenly tracked movement with sharp awareness. Within minutes, Miguel was sitting up unassisted for the first time in his life. Within an hour, he was taking tentative steps. By evening, he was running around the motel room, chattering in both Spanish and English. Similar stories multiplied daily. James Patterson, a construction worker from Detroit, arrived with severe chronic back pain from a workplace injury. After spending time at the statue, he was able to lift his infant daughter above his head for the first time in 2 years. Rebecca Walsh, a cancer patient from Philadelphia, saw her tumors begin shrinking immediately after drinking from the stream. David Kim, a veteran suffering from severe PTSD, found his anxiety and nightmares disappearing after a single encounter with the mysterious water. But perhaps the most documented case involved Jonathan Miller, doctor. Robert Miller's own nephew, who arrived from Chicago with end-stage kidney disease. Jonathan was 28 years old, a talented architect whose career had been cut short by polycystic kidney disease. He'd been on dialysis for 8 months, growing weaker despite treatment, and his doctors had given him perhaps 6 months to live unless a donor kidney became available. Dr. Miller watched his nephew kneel beside the statue with a mixture of scientific skepticism and personal anguish. Jonathan drank from the stream and sat quietly beside the flowing water for nearly an hour. At first, nothing visible occurred, but by the next morning, something had clearly changed. Jonathan woke up energetic for the first time in months. His appetite returned, his mental clarity sharp. When they drove back to Chicago 2 days later, blood tests revealed that his kidney function had improved dramatically. "I can't explain what happened," Jonathan's nephrologist told the family. His kidney function has improved to nearly normal levels. If I didn't have his previous test results right here in front of me, I'd say this was a different patient entirely. Dr. Miller found himself in an uncomfortable position. As a scientist, he remained committed to seeking natural explanations for apparently supernatural phenomena. But as a family member who'd witnessed his nephew's transformation firsthand, he could no longer dismiss the Clearwater healings as mere psychological suggestion. As winter settled over Ohio, the stream at Mary's feet performed perhaps its most impossible feat. While farm ponds froze solid and the river turned to ice, the healing water flowed unhindered, as warm as a spring day. Snow fell around the statue, but within a 3-foot radius of the stream, the ground remained mysteriously clear and dry. Flowers, roses that shouldn't bloom in December, sprouted in perfect circles around Mary's base. Paul Harris had transformed completely. The man who'd once hurled paint in anger now spent his days maintaining the square, sweeping snow from walkways, and gently guiding pilgrims to the water. Children no longer feared him. They called him Mr. Paul and brought him drawings of angels and rainbows. Christmas Eve brought Clearwater's most profound miracle yet. As darkness fell, hundreds of people gathered in the square for a candlelight vigil. Catholics and Protestants, believers and skeptics, pilgrims and locals, all united in wonder at the impossible spring that continued flowing despite temperatures well below freezing. Father O'Connor stepped forward to address the crowd, but before he could speak, the air around the statue began to shimmer. A warm light, golden and soft, emanated not from any earthly source, but from the marble itself. In that radiance, several dozen people swore they saw Mary's lips curve into the faintest smile. Her eyes, carved from stone, seemed to look directly into the hearts of every person present. And in that moment, atheists felt the touch of grace. Christians experienced profound peace, and the curious found their souls stirring with inexplicable joy. The light lasted only moments, but its effect was eternal. Then, spontaneously, people began to sing. Not any particular hymn, but whatever carols came to their hearts. Voices blended across denominational lines as Silent Night mixed with Amazing Grace and Spanish versions of ancient Marian hymns. And in the profound silence between songs, many swore they heard something else, ethereal melodies that seemed to come from the flowing water itself. Not human voices, though the sound was recognizably vocal. It was something entirely other. Celestial music that spoke directly to the heart rather than the ears, carrying wordless messages of comfort, hope, and infinite love. The snow that had been falling all day stopped. The stars shone with unusual brilliance. And in the center of it all, the water flowed on, carrying healing to anyone humble enough to receive it, 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 to receive it.